So we got a lot of comments back from my prior videos about learning Cree. We got a lot of comments that they didn't like her sitting on my lap. just one. We got comments saying that she's too young to be my girlfriend. Yeah, well, it's working out great, okay? We got comments, some of them reflecting really cynical Canadian attitudes. I wouldn't even really say racist attitudes towards First Nations, but just contemptuous and dismissive attitudes towards First Nations languages. And I wanted to make a positive video talking about the fact that you really can learn Cree and Ojibwe. Now, we're just talking about this. And you were mostly talking about your own decisions to learn German, to not learn French, your educational options, in terms of a kind of economic instrumentality. Right? And that's really the exact opposite of what I want to talk about in this video. I mean, it makes sense, but she, like many of the people who commented on my prior video, she was saying, in effect, that she would look at this as a high school student, I'm guessing? Not as a primary school student.
Yeah.
Okay. As a high school student looking at this thinking, how are you ever going to earn money out of being able to speak French? How are you going to be able to learn money out of studying a modern language like Spanish or German, etc.? Right? Now that's interesting. Somebody must have taught you to think that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, my dad.
Okay, so that's very clear. So your dad directly taught you to think of this in terms of economic outcomes. And many of the people commenting on my video, they're not crazy. I just disagree with them. It's just a different perspective. They looked at this question of teaching Cree, studying Cree, teaching Ojibwe, studying Ojibwe, or Mohawk or Dene or any of these languages. They looked at that as something incompatible with a fundamentally economic worldview, that all education has to serve this type of profit-seeking motive and an outcome. And it doesn't. Why do students study Shakespeare? How meaningful is Shakespeare for the average 12-year-old or the average 15-year-old or even the average 25-year-old? I think we can really question that. You know, really, I've known a small number of people who find Shakespeare really meaningful. Most don't. Most don't. For most, it's just a drag. For most, it's just a waste of time. I think a lot of kids ask, why am I being forced to memorize this speech out of Hamlet? You know.
That is something that's gone by the wayside, by the way.
What?
Memorizing poems, memorizing literature.
We still had to memorize a couple things when I was coming up. No? You didn't
Not at
memorize?
all. Not until college.
Okay. Oh, okay. You did have memorization in college. Oh, interesting. Okay. Anyway, you know, is this just a ritual based on a smug sense of cultural superiority that if you're a refined and educated person, you ought to know Shakespeare, or what? Now, in that context, learning Cree, learning Ojibwe, learning Mohawk or Dene, you can put it in another native language here, is that more or less meaningful than studying Shakespeare? For at least some people, it's going to be more meaningful, right? It's going to be more meaningful, obviously, if you actually have Cree heritage, if you care about Cree heritage and history and customs and what have you, okay? But I actually think it's a lot more meaningful for a lot of white people, too. Think if you're a white person and you can sit down and really examine what's meaningful in your life, you know, in a static sense of looking at one snapshot, it's probably not Shakespeare. And then if you look moving forward, let's just say you're a white person who lives in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and you drive around and interact with diverse people in the northern half of Saskatchewan as part of your job and part of your life. If you now take 10 hours a week to study Shakespeare, how is that going to improve your life or make it more meaningful? I've got to tell you, if you took that time and put it into Cree, it actually would make your life more meaningful. It actually would be really rewarding. That would be true with Cree in northern Saskatchewan. It would be true of Ojibwe in western Ontario. Okay? And let me tell you, life in Saskatchewan is really bleak. I think life in western Ontario is also really bleak. And I think it's intellectually rewarding and meaningful for you as an adult to sit down and take the time to put into learning Cree or learning Ojibwe. I think it's rewarding. It is of some practical value. You're going to make new friends. You're going to see new perspectives. You know, a living language, it's not like studying ancient Greek. It's not like studying Latin. It's really not. There are positive things in your life that are going to come out of it, especially if you live in a part of Canada where 10% of the population identifies as Indigenous and has some connection to that language and that heritage. But even with that aside, there's a question of what are you comparing it to? I don't think very much of the math I was taught in my education had any economic value whatsoever. And I remember other students loudly complaining, why am I learning this crap? What I learned about math didn't help me economic. What I learned about physics didn't help me economic. If you take a narrow economic view of the utility of education and say everything this person learns, everything we teach, has to put dollars and cents into their pocket, there's not that much to teach and there's not that much to learn, is there? Now, on the other hand, if you look at learning Cree and learning Ojibwe as part of the meaning of life and of having a meaningful life, where you're saying, well, a lot of white people spend 8 hours a week watching sports. Let's just say 8 hours a week watching junk on TV. But, football, baseball, ice hockey, that's a lot of time. It's a significant percentage of your brain and your emotional and mental energy. You could be putting that time into learning ancient Greek. You could be putting that time into learning Latin. You could be, I can speak from experience of this, you could put that time into learning Sanskrit or Pali. These are some languages I really have experience with. You could be putting that time into learning Chinese. That's true, And I've got to tell you positively, a language like Cree or Ojibwe is much, much easier to learn than Chinese. It's much easier. There's no comparison in terms of the level of difficulty and the point at which it would become rewarding to learn that language, the point at which you can put a sentence together. So, you've been studying Chinese for a couple of months and not that hard, not putting that much effort into it. But still, to string a sentence together in Chinese for someone who speaks English as the first language, really, really challenging, right? Now, I can also ask, so that's difficulty. How difficult is this to do in an absolute sense? You don't even need to be intelligent. Nobody needs to be intelligent to learn a language. Little children learn languages. You can be complete idiots who have a high level of ability in language. It really doesn't take intelligence. You just have to do the work. If you do the work, you get the results with language learning. Maybe being brilliant helps, but I don't know if it even helps 10%. It's a small edge to be brilliant when we're talking about language learning. It's something any idiot can do, including you. Including you, dear viewer. So that's the question of difficulty. The other question is how meaningful or how rewarding is it in your life, right? So this came up the other day. We talked about this with French. You can learn French. Is there any book you want to read in French that hasn't been translated into English? Is there anything you want to learn or access, that you're not going to be able to access in English? Maybe the answer is yes for you. Maybe you're passionate about some kind of French philosophy or French literature that makes that a worldview. Fine. Your call, your decision, right? For me, when I look at a lot of these languages, it's very hard for me to be motivated to learn French for that reason. There's really nothing I want to read in French. There's nobody, right now in my life, there's nobody I want to talk to in French. I don't really want to live in France. We may make that decision. We may move to France. It's quite possible in our future, actually. Okay, but it's actually really hard for me to make that commitment to learning French. An ancient language like Sanskrit or Pali or Latin or Greek, maybe there's something you want to read that's going to make that meaningful and rewarding to you, right? Maybe that's going to light up your life. You live in northern Saskatchewan or you live in western Ontario, and it's going to make your nights a little bit less cold and bleak and awful if you can sit there and read Aristotle in the original ancient Greek or whatever it is you like. You can sit there and read Cicero in Latin, etc., right?
Who does that?
I know. People watch sports instead of doing these things. And people descend into alcoholism and gambling and skiing and other things to try to make their lives feel meaningful when they could be reading Latin Greek. I got to tell you, I do think for the vast majority of people, if you live in Western Ontario, studying Ojibwe, studying Soto, or studying one of these languages, or possibly studying OG Cree, which is also a dialect of Ojibwe, I think that really is more meaningful. It really is more rewarding. Maybe in ways that would surprise you. Now, of course, it can open up doors for you economically. Absolutely, it can. But from my perspective, that is really beside the point. If you're living in northern Saskatchewan, learning Cree, I think, can be tremendously rewarding. I met one white police officer, and he started learning Cree, and a lot of his experience in terms of law enforcement and the prisons and everything else was working with Cree people and so on. Yeah. There are ways in which that's going to enrich his practice, his life, his career as a police officer. People are going to share other perspectives with him. It's going to make him a bit of a cultural insider. It's going to give him a different perspective that he would never have as a white man only speaking English, or if he learns Chinese or what have you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if you want to jump in. But, we deal with this line of reasoning a lot in veganism, where people say, well, it's just a personal choice. Of course it's a personal choice. What language you learn is a personal choice. You can talk to Cree people who will explain to you that they made the decision not to learn Cree. They made the decision that this language doesn't matter to them, whether it's Cree or Ojibwe or what have you. There are people who will walk you through what their reasons are. Of course, it's a personal choice. But part of the reason for human beings having a conversation is to talk about, is this a good choice or is this a bad choice? What's the best choice? And for sure, I mean, I've known people who taught themselves Sanskrit. I taught myself Pali. I've met people who taught themselves Latin and Greek and Chinese, all these languages. And I myself have studied many languages, including Chinese, blah, blah, blah. I have a lot of experience with language learning. You can do it. It is just your choice, sure. But it's probably a choice that not enough people have really thought about or really taken seriously. When you watch football sitting on the couch every week, you're making no personal progress. You're gaining nothing. You're left at the end of it entertained but empty. Okay, if you took those few couple of hours a week to work on Cree or Ojibwe or any First Nations language, you would be making progress. You'd be making progress day by day, week by week. Your life would become more meaningful. It brings a lot of really positive stuff into your life. It's very rewarding. Can I say it's easy? I can tell you it's easier than learning Chinese. I can tell you, and we just can't look at our own education, whether on a systemic level or in terms of just our own private lives as individuals, purely in terms of economic outcomes. If you feel Shakespeare is meaningless, I feel you. I completely, in some ways Shakespeare is meaningful, in some ways it's meaningless. That's up to you. That's your personal choice also. Mm-hmm. But we live in a society that thinks nothing of demanding that you take on this kind of literature with no possible economic outcome and really no possible way for you to progress personally through it, for you to evolve or get something no positive in your life. And I can tell you, the study of languages, it's really rewarding in all those ways. And whether or not it's more work than studying William Shakespeare, I think that's debatable. Okay.